A man sits on a dirt floor in a rented room somewhere near the Aegean Sea, holding a reed pen over a piece of coarse papyrus. At the political machinery stretching from the cliffs of Britain all the way to the deserts of Babylon, you start to see something, and the translated Greek. They read Micah, promising a ruler from the tiny village of Bethlehem. They read Zechariah, promising a king who will shatter the bow of the oppressor. They read these words of ultimate liberation while listening to the metallic scrape of Roman armor marching just outside the synagogue window. They are living in a cognitive dissonance that is tearing them apart. Most people assume this 400-year gap was a period of spiritual stagnation. They assume the Jewish people simply fell asleep, going through empty religious motions, while the real history happened in the political halls of Rome and Athens. The silence was not an abandonment. It was a pressure cooker. When you take an ancient, ironclad promise of divine rescue, and you press it down under the suffocating, bloody weight of Roman occupation, you do not extinguish the hope. You compress it. You make it volatile. By the time the 1st century arrives, the air in Judea is thick with messianic fever. It is a palpable, almost violent anticipation. You can feel it in the dust of the streets. You can see it in the tightened jawlines of the zealots, hiding curved daggers inside their cloaks, waiting to bleed for the kingdom. Every time a charismatic rabbi walks out into the Judean desert, thousands of people drop their fishing nets, abandon their plows, and follow him into the wasteland, desperate for the spark. They are scanning the horizon for a military conqueror. The arbitrary reading completely misses. The 1st century was not a blank canvas. It was a loaded spring, the real question of the nativity. They are checking the bloodlines of every teacher who performs a miracle. They are a people stretched so tight that a single new note from heaven could snap the string. The Greek language gave the message a universal voice. The Roman roads gave the messengers a paved highway. But the 400 years of crushing silence gave the audience a desperate, burning hunger. God had engineered the exact environment where the arrival of a Messiah would not just be news. It would be a detonation. But waiting in the dark for a voice that refuses to speak changes a person. And the agony of that ancient silence is not just a historical footnote. It is the blueprint for how God handles the space between a promise and its fulfillment. If you have ever sat in the sterile quiet of a hospital waiting room, staring at the fluorescent lights, while you wait for a doctor to walk through the double doors with news, you know exactly what this silence feels like. If you are in a season where you wake up and the heavy reality of your circumstances hits your chest before your feet even touch the wood floor, you are standing exactly where the 1st century world stood. You hold the ancient promises of the text in one hand. Isn't just, why did he come? It's this. Why exactly then? Paul uses the word pleroma. We translate it as fullness. You hold the brutal, unmoving reality of your daily life in the other. You pray a specific prayer. You wait for the heavy silence to break. But the sky remains like iron. When you are trapped in the middle of a prolonged silence, it is incredibly easy to believe that the story has ended. You assume that if the voice of God is quiet, the hands of God are completely still. You assume that because the heavens are not shouting, the narrative has stalled. The waiting room is not a holding cell. It is a forge. We want the instant deliverance. We want the cinematic rescue where the clouds split open and the oppressors are immediately swallowed whole. But the pleroma, the fullness of time, demands a different kind of endurance, because God does not measure time by the panic of a human clock. While Israel sat in the dark, vibrating with a painful hunger for rescue, God was quietly paving the literal stones that would carry their deliverance to the edges of the earth. He was minting the exact vocabulary that their grandchildren would use to explain the cross to a pagan world. He was working in the deep, invisible geopolitical structures of the world, rearranging empires in the dark, doing things that no one would possibly understand until they were looking at it in the rearview mirror. The delay is not a denial, but the Greek word carries the weight of a merchant ship being fully loaded with cargo, or a cup being filled until the exact drop. It is a calculated loading of the cargo hold. The cup must be filled to the exact molecular limit before the water is finally allowed to spill over. The infrastructure must be completely in place before the weight of the glory can be placed upon it. But the Romans and the Greeks were not the only ones being positioned in the dark. God was also using the deepest trauma of the Jewish people themselves, their violent exile, their scattering away from the temple, the burning of their ancient homes, to build a hidden network across the entire Mediterranean, a network that was hiding in plain sight, just waiting for a match to strike. Look at a map of the Roman Empire in the 1st century. Look past the military garrisons. Look past the marble imperial palaces. Look into the crowded, dusty neighborhoods of almost every major Mediterranean city. You will find hundreds of inconspicuous buildings. They smell of burning wax. They smell of old leather. They smell of sea salt and dust. The synagogues. For centuries, ancient empires tried to completely erase the Jewish people. Assyria broke the northern tribes. Babylon burned the southern temple to the ground. The people were dragged away in heavy iron chains. They wept by foreign rivers. They survived in hostile, alien cities. And then they scattered, where the surface tension breaks and the water finally spills over the edge. Time itself was filling up. Every war, every treaty. They moved to Alexandria. They settled in Corinth. They traded in Ephesus. They lived in the dark shadows of Rome itself. Because they had no central temple, they built local houses of study. Every Sabbath, they gathered. They unrolled the heavy, animal skin scrolls. They read the ancient prophets out loud in Greek. They kept the messianic fire burning in the middle of a pagan world. Most people look at the Babylonian exile and see a massive historical tragedy. The scattering was not a defeat. It was a strategic deployment. God used the violent ambition of conquering kings to pre-position outposts of truth in every major city on earth. When the Apostle Paul walks into a new Roman colony to preach the resurrected Christ, he does not stand on a random street corner. He does not have to spend 10 years explaining the concept of a single, holy God to a crowd of pagans who worship Jupiter. He walks straight into the synagogue. The audience is already gathered. The Greek language is already being spoken. The Old Testament context is already deeply understood. And sitting in the back rows of those synagogues are the God-fearers, Gentiles who were drawn to the morality of Israel but had not fully converted. They are the dry kindling. Paul just brings the match. A message that should have taken centuries to cross borders takes weeks. Every paved road, every translated scroll was another drop in the cup. The world was being shaped, violently and methodically. For a single weekend in Jerusalem, a movement that should have died in a provincial backwater becomes a global earthquake. The Roman roads take the apostles to the city. The Greek language lets them speak to the masses. But the synagogue provides the exact pre-built launchpad. The gospel hits the diaspora network, and it travels through the empire like fire through a dry wheat field. The board is now completely set. The universal tongue, the stone highways, the desperate hunger of a silent sky, the scattered outposts of the synagogue. The container of time has been packed until it groans under the pressure. The pleroma is reached. The water is trembling at the absolute edge of the cup. And then, a 33-year-old rabbi walks toward a skull-shaped hill outside Jerusalem, carrying the rough timber that will finally break the surface tension. A heavy iron hammer strikes a hand-forged spike. The metallic crack echoes across the skull-shaped limestone quarry just outside the city walls. The air smells of dry dust, sweat, and cheap, sour wine. A Roman execution squad goes to work with the brutal, methodical efficiency that built an empire, hoisting a battered, suffocating Jewish rabbi up against the pale Judean sky. To the naked eye, it looks like a localized tragedy. It looks like the tragic, the bloody end of another false messiah who ran afoul of the political machinery of the Pax Romana. If Jesus arrives a few centuries earlier, his message gets trapped in the mountains of Judea, isolated by geography and impossible language barriers. The cross is not a provincial execution. It is the gravitational center of human history. Look at the physical details of what is happening on that hill. Look at the parchment title board that the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, ordered to be nailed to the rough timber just above the dying rabbi's head. The Jewish religious leaders hated it. They begged Pilate to change it, to make it say that this man merely claimed to be a king, but Pilate refused, leaving the indictment flapping in the wind for the entire world to read. And he wrote it in 3 specific languages. He wrote it in Hebrew, the ancient, covenantal language of the prophets, the language of the temple, the language of a people who had just endured 400 years of suffocating silence, waiting for a promised king. He wrote it in Latin, the language of the empire, the language of the legions, who paved the massive stone web of roads stretching out from the base of this very hill, the roads that would soon carry the news of this afternoon to the absolute edges of the earth. And he wrote it in Greek, the universal tongue of the marketplace, the linguistic architecture built by Alexander the Great, the exact dialect that the scattered diaspora synagogues would use to read the ancient prophecies and explain who this dying man actually was. The convergence is absolute. Everything that pagan kings built for their own glory, everything that emperors violently conquered to secure their own borders. If he arrives a few centuries later, the empire that built the highways is fractured and burning, and travel is suicide. Everything that the Jewish people endured in their traumatic exile, it all perfectly intersects on a few pieces of wood on a Friday afternoon. God did not send his son into a random chronological vacuum. The cup was filled to the absolute brim. The pleroma was reached. Every historical, linguistic, and geopolitical requirement had been systematically locked into place in the dark. And when the rabbi pushes up on his nailed feet, fills his collapsing lungs with air, and shouts that it is finished, the surface tension finally breaks. The water spills over the edge. The message is released onto the highways. But the fullness of time is not just a historical blueprint about the ancient Mediterranean. It leaves us with an echo that travels down through 2,000 years of history, landing directly in the middle of the exact battle you are fighting today. A Macedonian king forced a single language on the ancient world and provided the exact vocabulary for a coming revelation. Jewish scholars translated their Hebrew scrolls in Egypt and unlocked the prophetic vault for a pagan audience. Roman legions laid down 50,000 miles of heavy stone and built the physical runway for a theological revolution. An emperor enforced a brutal global peace and erased the borders that would have trapped the messengers in Judea. The timing is so mathematically precise that it defies probability. To understand what Paul meant by the fullness of time, you have to realize the heavens went completely silent for 400 years and created a desperate, explosive hunger for rescue. A conquered people scattered to build quiet synagogues in hostile cities and pre-positioned the launch pads for a global earthquake. And a Roman governor nailed a parchment board over a dying rabbi in 3 specific languages, and unwittingly declared to the entire known world that the wait was over. Same cup, same fullness. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the silence. The agonizing 400-year gap where the sky was like iron, and the prophets put down their pens. The quiet was not an absence. It was an architecture. God was working in the deep dark, moving empires and paving literal stones, preparing the exact infrastructure needed to carry a promise that would eventually break the world open. If you are in a season where the delay feels exactly like a denial, if you are standing in the waiting room of your own life, holding a promise in one hand and a brutal, unmoving reality in the other, assuming that because heaven is quiet, the narrative has completely stalled. Look at the 1st century. Look at the pleroma. The container is not measured by the panic of a human clock. The cargo hold is still being loaded. That God was not just preparing a mother. He was terraforming an entire planet. He was using the ambition of pagan kings. The roads are still being paved in the dark. And may the God who used the violent ambition of pagan kings to prepare the way for his son use the hidden, silent seasons of your own life to build something you could not have carried any other way. If this opened something in you, subscribe and leave a comment, even one word. helps. Share this with someone who is sitting in the middle of their own silence right now. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts. The air is thick with dust and the smell of olive oil burning in a small clay lamp. He is not writing a theology textbook. The greed of emperors and the blood of conquerors to build the exact infrastructure needed for a Jewish rabbi's death to reach the edges of the earth in a single generation. And to see how the board was set, you have to look away from the manger. You have to step back 330 years before the angels ever showed up in the night sky. You have to look at a 22-year-old Macedonian king, sitting on a horse, pointing a sword toward the east, completely unaware that he is doing the heavy lifting for a god he does not even know. Alexander the Great did not care about the God of Israel. He cared about the horizon, and he cared about glory. When his Macedonian phalanxes swept across the ancient world in the 4th century BC, they left behind garrisons and governors. But their most lethal weapon was not made of bronze or wood. It was made of syllables. Alexander was obsessed with Hellenization, the aggressive exporting of Greek culture, philosophy, and above all, language. Before Alexander, the Mediterranean and Near East were a fractured acoustic landscape. If a Jewish rabbi had a message for the world, that message would hit a brick wall of dialect the moment he walked 50 miles in any direction. He is writing an urgent, bleeding letter to a group of churches in the region of Galatia, people who are confused. You had Aramaic in the Levant, Coptic in Egypt, ancient Persian in the East, and 100 local tribal tongues filling the gaps. Ideas were geographically quarantined. Then came Koine Greek. This was not the elevated, poetic Greek of Homer or the elite philosophers in Athens. Koine means common. It was the street language of the empire. It was the grit and syntax of the marketplace, the vocabulary of the docks, the language a Syrian merchant used to haggle over the price of dried fish with a sailor in Ephesus. It was incredibly precise, capable of conveying profound philosophical nuance, yet entirely accessible to a slave loading cargo onto a ship. Alexander was not building an eternal kingdom. He was writing the dictionary for a kingdom that would outlast his own. By the time the dust settled from his conquests, a profound linguistic shift had taken place. For the first time in human history, a single language spanned from the Pillars of Hercules to the borders of India. And this shift triggered something unprecedented in Alexandria, Egypt. About 2 centuries before Jesus was born, Jewish scholars realized their own people in the diaspora were forgetting Hebrew. So, in rooms smelling of damp parchment and sea air, people who are being pulled backward into a religious system they were supposed to leave behind. He dips the reed into the ink. They sat down and translated the ancient Hebrew scrolls of the Old Testament into Koine Greek. This translation, known as the Septuagint, suddenly unlocked the locked vault of Jewish prophecy. The promises of Isaiah were no longer confined to Hebrew scholars in Jerusalem. They were available to anyone who could read a receipt in the marketplace. The theological vocabulary for sin, redemption, sacrifice, and the Messiah was systematically minted in the exact language that the entire known world already spoke. When the apostles eventually sat down to write the New Testament, they did not have to invent a vocabulary to explain who Jesus was. The linguistic architecture had already been built, tested, and distributed by a pagan king who thought he was working for himself. The Greek language became the acoustic chamber for the revolution. But a universal language is only half the equation. You can have a message perfectly translated into the tongue of the masses, but it means absolutely nothing if the messengers cannot physically reach the cities where those masses live. The words were ready to travel. Now, they needed a mechanism to physically cross the earth. A Roman legionnaire kneels in the mud of a foreign province. He lifts a heavy basalt block. He traces out a single, precise phrase in Greek, "Ote de elphen tu pleroma tu chrono." When the fullness of the time had come, he slams it down into a bed of crushed gravel and sand. He wipes the grit from his eyes. He moves to the next block. He is building a road. He thinks he is securing the empire. He thinks he is laying a path for the legions to march. He thinks he is making way for the emperor's tax carts. He is not building a supply line. He is paving the runway for a revolution. Stone by stone, mile by mile, the empire connects the fragmented world. They carve tunnels through solid granite. They suspend timber bridges over violent rivers. They lay down 50,000 miles of interlocking stone. The Appian Way, the Egnatian Way, from the rain-soaked forests of Britain to the blinding white heat of the Syrian desert, it is a web of absolute control. Before Rome, travel is almost certain suicide. Bandits hide in the unmapped hills. Pirates rule the Mediterranean sea lanes. Borders shift in the blood of every petty tribal war. A traveler expects to be robbed. A merchant expects to lose his cargo. Then Caesar Augustus takes power. He sends the war galleys. He crushes the pirates. He breaks the tribal chieftains. He enforces a brutal, suffocating global peace. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The sea lanes open. The roads become safe. The borders disappear. Most people read the story of Jesus and focus entirely on the who and the where. They see a young woman giving birth in a Bethlehem stable, the clatter of horse hooves, the iron wheels of chariots, the marching sandals of centurions. The roads are built for violence and taxes, but they are used for something else entirely. A man can now walk from the steps of the temple in Jerusalem to the coast of Spain without crossing a single hostile frontier. He needs no passport. He fears no pirates. He walks on paved stone, beneath the shadow of Roman guard towers. This is the physical infrastructure of the fullness of time. Alexander the Great gives the world a single voice. Caesar Augustus gives the world a single street. The message has its language. The messengers have their highway. If a man stands up in Antioch and preaches a resurrected king, his words can travel to Rome in weeks, not decades. The friction of geography has been erased by the ambition of pagan kings. But a highway is just dead stone. A language is just empty sound. They do not create the hunger. They do not explain why thousands of people, scattered across this massive empire, are sitting in the dark, vibrating with anticipation. To understand the tension, you have to look into the text itself. You have to look at the specific word Paul chooses to write in that dusty room. Look at the text of Galatians chapter 4. Verse 4. Paul is outlining the difference between a slave and an heir. Shepherds, shivering on a hillside. Wise men carrying spices. They assume the timing itself was arbitrary. They think God simply looked down, explaining how humanity was kept under the guardrails of the law until the precise moment of maturity. And to describe that moment, he writes, "But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son." The word our English Bibles translate as fullness is the Greek noun pleroma. It is a word that carries an incredible amount of physical weight. In the ancient world, pleroma was frequently used as a maritime term. If you walked down to a harbor in Ephesus or Corinth and smelled the salt water and pitch, you might point to a merchant vessel sitting low in the water. When that ship had its complete crew on board, every seat at the oars filled, and its cargo hold packed so tightly with grain that not another sack could fit, that ship was in a state of pleroma. It was fully loaded and ready to launch. The word was also used for a debt that had been paid down to the final copper coin, or a clay cup that had been filled with water, right up to the brim, trembling at the exact molecular limit before it spills over the edge. If this kind of microscopic precision in the text is answering questions you didn't know you had, you're exactly who this channel is for. At a random Tuesday in the 1st century, saw that things were suitably dark, and decided to hit a cosmic button to send a savior. Hit subscribe and leave a thought in the comments. Because every week we go deeper into these ancient languages than you knew was possible. So Paul looks at the timeline of human history. He does not use a word for a random chronological date. He uses a word that implies a container being actively, deliberately stuffed to maximum capacity. God was depositing language into the container through Alexander. He was depositing infrastructure into the container through Augustus. He was placing geopolitical stability, philosophy, and roads into the cargo hold of history, one heavy block at a time. And he kept filling it, century after century, until the surface tension broke. Pleroma changes everything about how you read the Nativity. The first century was not a random coordinate on a map. It was a cup overflowing. When Paul uses this word, he is telling the Galatians that the arrival of Jesus was the triggering of a trap that had been set since the foundation of the world. It is the exact same word Paul uses in Ephesians 1:10, when he talks about God gathering all things together in the pleroma of the times. The time was not just passing, the time was pregnant. But all of this Greek language and Roman infrastructure only set the external stage. They provided the vehicle. They did not provide the spark. But if you look closer at the world outside, that's stable at the stones beneath the traveler's feet, at the language being shouted in the street, you can have the safest roads and the clearest language in the world. But if nobody is waiting for a message, the messengers will just be talking to the wind. God did not just prepare the pagan world to carry the message. He prepared his own people to desperately need it. And he did it by going completely, terrifyingly silent. The prophet Malachi drops his pen. The ink dries. The scroll is rolled away into the archives. The year is roughly 400 BC. And then, the sky closes. For 4 centuries, the God who spoke from burning bushes, the God who split oceans and brought fire down on mountaintops, goes entirely, terrifyingly silent. There are no angelic visitations in the night. There are no pillars of smoke in the desert. There are no wild prophetic voices shouting in the town squares. There is only the smell of burning animal fat on the altar, day after day, and the echo of old promises bouncing off the cold stone of the temple in Jerusalem. Empires march across their land like violently changing weather. The Persians come with their chariots. The Greeks come with their language. The Romans come with their iron and their crucifixions. And through it all, the Jewish people cling to the scrolls. They sit in the dim, flickering light of clay lamps, tracing their fingers over the ancient Hebrew.